When I tell you this story, you might think I made it up, that it's one of those urban legends meant to scare people into staying off the deep web. But I'm here to tell you, it happened. It happened to me. And every time I close my eyes, I still feel the weight of what I did. It started with the kind of desperation most people are lucky enough to never know. My brother James was dying. He had a rare degenerative condition, one that left his body eating itself from the inside out. The doctors had names for it, long Latin ones that sounded as hopeless as they felt. It's irreversible, they told us. There's no cure, no treatment that we can offer. James was only 26. He wasn't supposed to be planning a funeral. He was supposed to be planning a life. I sat in that hospital room, surrounded by machines that beeped and whirred uselessly, as my brother, my best friend, slipped away one agonizing day at a time. I couldn't just let him go. I'd heard rumors, stories whispered on forums and in dark corners of the internet, about a surgeon who worked outside the law, someone who didn't care about regulations or approvals, someone who could do the impossible for a price. They called him the sculptor. The name alone gave me chills. It sounded like something out of a horror movie. But desperation does strange things to a person. It makes you ignore red flags, warnings, even your own gut screaming at you to stop. I wasn't thinking straight. I was thinking about James and the life he deserved to have. The search wasn't easy. The sculptor didn't advertise on the regular internet. He didn't need to. You had to go digging, deep into places where normal people don't belong. I spent days navigating forums full of cryptic messages and half-truths until I finally found it. A thread buried under layers of encryption. The instructions were simple but terrifying. Send your request here. Be specific. You'll be contacted if he's interested. Don't follow up. Don't ask questions. My fingers trembled as I typed the email. I laid everything out. James's condition, the doctor's verdict, and my willingness to pay whatever it took to save him. Then I hit send. For 3 days, nothing. No response, no acknowledgement. I started to think it had all been a cruel joke, that maybe the sculptor was just a myth, a story desperate people told themselves when they had no other options. And then the email came. It was short, clinical. I can help. Bring him to the attached location at 11 p.m. on Saturday. $50,000 in cash. No observers. No questions. I stared at the screen, my heart racing. The location was an abandoned factory on the outskirts of the city. The kind of place where deals go bad and bodies are found. I should have walked away. I should have accepted the inevitable. But how could I? How could I live with myself if I didn't try? The night of the meeting, I borrowed a friend's van to transport James. His condition had worsened. He was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and uneven. I stuffed the duffel bag of cash under the passenger's seat and drove through the rain, my heart pounding with every mile. The factory loomed in the distance like something out of a nightmare. Rusted metal, broken windows, and an air of abandonment that made my skin crawl. I parked near a side entrance and waited, staring at the clock as it ticked toward 11. Exactly on time, the door creaked open. A man stepped out, his face obscured by the hood of his raincoat. He didn't speak, just motioned for me to follow him inside. The interior was worse than I imagined. Dark, damp, and reeking of mildew and chemicals. But the makeshift operating room was spotless. A metal table sat under a harsh, fluorescent light, surrounded by equipment that looked old but functional. The man finally pulled back his hood, revealing a face so ordinary it was unsettling. He looked like an accountant or a school teacher, someone you'd pass on the street without a second thought. But his eyes were cold, empty of anything resembling empathy. "Lay him on the table," he said, his voice sharp and commanding. I hesitated, clutching the handles of James's wheelchair. "Are you sure you can help him?" The man's expression didn't change. "I don't take patients I can't help. Do you want this or not?" Swallowing my fear, I lifted James onto the table. He groaned weakly, his eyelids fluttering but not opening. The sculptor moved with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times. He didn't waste words or motions, preparing his tools and connecting wires to monitors that beeped in sync with James's slowing heartbeat. And then he turned to me. "You need to leave," he said. "Come back in the morning. If he survives the night, he'll be alive. If he doesn't, he shrugged as if the thought didn't bother him in the slightest. Every instinct screamed at me not to leave, but the man's gaze was unrelenting, and something told me that if I stayed, I wouldn't be walking out. So I left. I spent the night pacing the parking lot, drenched from the rain and jumping at every shadow. My phone buzzed with missed calls and texts, but I ignored them all. My entire world was in that factory, lying on that cold metal table. When the sun finally rose, I went back inside. The factory was silent, the operating room empty. James was gone, and then I heard the sound, a wet, shuffling noise coming from the shadows. "James," I called, my voice cracking. Something stepped into the light. It looked like James, but it wasn't. The thing that stepped into the light wore my brother's face, but it wasn't him, not entirely. His eyes, once warm and familiar, were glassy and unfocused. His movements were jerky, as if he were a marionette being controlled by someone who didn't quite know the strings. "James?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He, or it, didn't answer. He just stood there, swaying slightly, his head cocked at an unnatural angle. His skin looked wrong, too pale, almost translucent, and there was a strange, faint glow beneath the surface, like veins illuminated from within. I stepped closer, my stomach knotting with dread. "James, it's me. It's okay. You're safe now." He blinked, slow and deliberate, like someone trying to remember how. Then in a voice that wasn't entirely his own, he rasped, "What did you do?" "I saved you," I said, my voice cracking. "The surgeon, he said he could help. You were dying, James. I didn't have a choice." James's mouth opened, but instead of words, a low, guttural groan came out. He clutched his stomach and doubled over, his body convulsing violently. "James!" I rushed forward, but he shoved me back with a strength he'd never had before. I stumbled, hitting the wall hard enough to knock the wind out of me. "Stay away," he growled through gritted teeth, his voice deep and distorted. His hands clawed at his chest, and for a horrifying moment, I thought he was going to rip his own skin off. I could only watch, frozen with terror, as James's convulsions subsided. When he straightened up, his face was calm again, but his eyes, they weren't his anymore. They were cold, unblinking, and alien. "I don't feel right," he said, his voice eerily calm. "We need to get you to a hospital," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "No hospital," he snapped, his tone sharp and commanding. "No one can know about this." Before I could argue, he turned and walked toward the exit, his gait unnervingly smooth. The James I knew had been weak, barely able to stand without help. Now he moved like a predator, silent, deliberate, and utterly in control. I hesitated, torn between calling for help and following him. But something told me that if I let him out of my sight, I might never see him again. I followed. The ride home was unbearable. James sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, his hands gripping the armrest so tightly that his knuckles turned white. I tried to ask him questions. What had happened, how he felt, but he didn't respond. He didn't even blink. When we got home, he went straight to his room and locked the door. I stood outside listening to the sounds of movement, furniture being dragged, drawers opening and closing. "James, let me in," I pleaded. "Please, I just want to help." There was no answer. Hours passed. I sat in the hallway, my back against the door, running through every worst-case scenario in my head. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep. I woke up to the sound of screaming. It wasn't James. It was coming from outside. I scrambled to my feet and ran to the window, my heart racing. A man was standing in the street, clutching his arm, which was bent at an unnatural angle. Blood dripped from his hand, pooling on the pavement. Then I saw James. He was standing over the man, his face expressionless, his hands slick with blood. "James!" I shouted, throwing open the front door and running outside. He turned to me slowly, his head tilting in that unsettling way. "He tried to break into the house," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. The man on the ground whimpered, shaking his head. I was just walking by." James's gaze never wavered. "He's lying." "James, stop!" I yelled, stepping between him and the man. "You're not like this. This isn't you." For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. but then it was gone, replaced by something cold and unfeeling. "I'm fine," he said, his tone flat. "Go back inside." I wanted to argue, to force him to explain what was happening, but there was something in his voice, something that made me feel like a child being scolded. I helped the injured man to his feet and watched as he limped away, throwing fearful glances over his shoulder. When I turned back to James, he was gone. That night I searched the internet for any mention of the sculptor, desperate for answers. But the thread where I'd found his contact information was gone, wiped clean as if it had never existed. I felt a growing sense of dread, like I had unleashed something I couldn't control. And then I saw it, movement in the corner of my eye. I turned, but nothing was there, just the shadows. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The days that followed were a nightmare. James barely spoke to me. He avoided sunlight, locking himself in his room during the day and emerging only at night. When he did, his behavior grew stranger by the hour. It started with his eating habits, or rather, the lack of them. At first, I chalked it up to recovery. Maybe he needed time to adjust. But it became clear that whatever the surgeon had done to him had changed something fundamental. One night, I found him standing in the kitchen, staring at the fridge with the door wide open. "James," I called softly. He turned to me, his face bathed in the pale glow of the refrigerator light. His eyes were hollow, sunken, and filled with something I couldn't place. Something primal. "I'm starving," he said, his voice raw. "Then eat," I said, gesturing to the food in the fridge. He shook his head slowly. "None of it works. It's wrong." I frowned, stepping closer. "What do you mean, wrong? It's food, James. Just try." He reached for a piece of leftover chicken, hesitated, and then sank his teeth into it. For a moment, I thought he was fine, until he gagged and spit it out violently, his body convulsing as if he'd swallowed poison. "It's disgusting," he rasped, wiping his mouth. "It's all disgusting." I stared at him, my mind racing. "What do you mean? You've eaten this stuff 1,000 times before." He didn't answer. Instead, he stormed out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there, heart pounding. The next night, I woke to the sound of muffled voices. I sat up in bed, straining to hear, but the house was eerily silent. I crept down the hallway, my footsteps light on the wooden floor. James's door was slightly ajar, and the faint glow of his computer screen spilled into the hallway. "James," I whispered, pushing the door open. He was hunched over his desk, his face illuminated by the sickly green light of a deep web chat room. The screen was filled with cryptic messages, usernames I didn't recognize, and symbols I couldn't decipher. "James, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't turn around. "Looking for answers." "Answers to what?" He finally glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "What he did to me." My blood ran cold. "The surgeon?" James nodded, his eyes darting back to the screen. "I've been tracking him. He's not what we thought he was." "What do you mean?" I asked, stepping closer. "He doesn't just perform surgeries," James said, his voice low and urgent. "He experiments. He transforms." I swallowed hard. "Transforms into what?" James didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to the screen, where a grainy video was playing. It showed a man lying on an operating table, his body restrained with heavy straps. The man was screaming, his voice muffled by a gag, as the sculptor leaned over him with a scalpel in hand. But it wasn't the scalpel that caught my attention. It was the surgeon's hands. They were too long, too thin, and covered in a pale, glistening membrane that shimmered under the harsh operating lights. "This is what he did to me," James said, his voice breaking. "He changed me." I stared at the screen, unable to look away as the video played on. The man on the table stopped screaming, his body convulsing violently. Then, in a horrifying display, his skin began to ripple and stretch as if something beneath it was trying to break free. I turned away, bile rising in my throat. "We have to stop this," I said, my voice shaking. James shook his head. "It's too late. He's already inside me." "What do you mean, inside you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he rolled up his sleeve, revealing a patch of skin on his arm that was no longer human. It was translucent, almost gelatinous, and pulsed faintly. like something alive. "I can feel him," James whispered, his voice trembling. "He's in my blood, in my mind. I'm not me anymore." Panic clawed at my chest. "We'll fix this," I said, desperate to believe my own words. "We'll find him, and we'll make him undo whatever he did to you." James laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "You don't understand. He doesn't undo. He only takes." Suddenly, the screen flickered and the chat room vanished, replaced by a single message. "You shouldn't have come looking." James's computer shut off, plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then James whispered, "He's watching." My stomach dropped. "Who's watching?" Before he could answer, the power in the house went out, plunging us into complete darkness. And then, from somewhere in the shadows, I heard it. A low, wet, slithering sound that sent ice through my veins. The darkness was oppressive, wrapping around us like a living thing. My breath hitched as the sound grew louder. A wet, dragging noise, like something heavy and alive being pulled across the floor. "James," I whispered, barely audible over the pounding of my own heartbeat. He didn't answer. I reached out for him, fumbling blindly in the dark, but he wasn't there. "James!" I hissed louder, panic clawing at my chest. The slithering stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, so thick it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. And then I heard it, a voice, soft and guttural, coming from somewhere just beyond the door. "You shouldn't have looked for me." It wasn't James. I froze, my body refusing to obey the primal urge to run. The voice was layered, as though several people were speaking at once, their words blending into something inhuman. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoed through the hallway. They weren't heavy like boots, but soft and wet, like bare flesh against the wooden floor. "James!" I called again, louder this time, my voice breaking. A faint glow flickered from the hallway, dim and sickly green. It spilled into the room, illuminating shapes that shouldn't exist, shadows that didn't belong to anything human. And then I saw him. James stood in the doorway, but it wasn't him. His eyes glowed faintly in the dark, a color I couldn't name, and his skin shimmered like the translucent film I'd seen on his arm earlier. "Get out," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "What?" I stammered, stepping back. "Leave now," he said again, more forcefully this time. "He's here." I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted for the door, but as I reached the hallway, the air around me seemed to thicken, slowing my movements. The faint green light grew brighter, pulsating like a heartbeat. And then I saw it. At the end of the hallway stood a figure, tall, impossibly thin, and shrouded in darkness. Its limbs were unnaturally long, tapering into sharp, claw-like fingers that glistened in the dim light. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unrelenting, boring into me. It took a step forward, its movements jerky and wrong, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. I stumbled back, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't cooperate. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at me, and for a moment I thought I heard it speak. Whispered words in a language I didn't understand, yet somehow felt in my bones. "Don't look at him!" James's voice snapped me out of my trance. I turned and ran, my legs finally responding. Behind me, the sound of wet footsteps grew louder, faster, as though the thing was chasing me. I reached the front door and yanked it open, the cool night air hitting my face like a slap. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street, my chest heaving, my lungs burning. When I finally dared to look back, the house was dark, its windows like empty eyes staring back at me. James was gone. The police were called the next day, but they didn't find anything unusual. The power outage had been restored, and the house looked exactly as it had before. No signs of struggle, no evidence of the horrors I'd witnessed, but James was nowhere to be found. I tried to explain, but the officers didn't believe me. They chalked it up to stress, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and worry. But I knew what I saw. In the days that followed, I tried to track down the sculptor, searching through every corner of the dark web I could access. But his trail had gone cold. Every forum, every chat room, every trace of him had been wiped clean. And then the emails started. At first, they were blank, just empty messages from untraceable addresses. But over time, they began to include cryptic messages. "You're not safe. Stop looking. He's watching you." I stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure, its clawed hands, its glowing eyes, the way it moved like a thing not bound by human laws. And then one night, I woke to find my computer on, the screen glowing faintly in the dark. A single message was displayed. "You should have stayed quiet." And in the reflection of the screen, I saw it, the figure standing behind me. I couldn't move. The figure loomed behind me, its presence suffocating, like the room itself was bending around it. My chest tightened as cold, clammy air brushed against the back of my neck. The figure didn't speak. It just stood there, impossibly tall and wrong, its long, claw-like fingers twitching at its sides. My breathing quickened, and the room felt like it was spinning. I don't remember how I got the strength to turn around, but when I did, it was gone. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind that makes your ears ring. I stumbled out of the room, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might explode. The house was still, eerily so, and every shadow felt alive, watching me. When I reached the front door, I grabbed the handle and yanked it open, only to find a solid wall of blackness outside. It wasn't the night sky. It wasn't darkness as we know it. It was something deeper, something alive. "Leaving won't save you," a voice rasped. I spun around and saw him. Not the figure, but the sculptor. He stood in the middle of the room, wearing the same stained lab coat, his face pale and hollowed. His glasses reflected the faint glow from my computer screen, obscuring his eyes, but I could feel his gaze piercing through me. "You shouldn't have come looking for me," he said, his tone eerily calm. "You don't understand the forces you've meddled with." "What did you do to James?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "What did you do to him?" The sculptor tilted his head, his lips curling into a faint, unsettling smile. "James got exactly what he asked for. He wanted to be better, stronger, faster. He wanted perfection. But perfection comes at a cost." My stomach churned. "What? What cost?" The sculptor stepped closer, his movements smooth and deliberate. "You think this is about surgery? About stitches and scalpels? Number, this is about the essence of humanity. When I operate, I don't just alter flesh. I reshape the soul." I backed away, but the room seemed to shrink around me. "You're insane," I whispered. "Am I?" he said, his smile widening. "Or are you just too blind to see the truth? People come to me because they're desperate. They think they can cheat fate, escape their flaws. But perfection, it's a burden most cannot bear." I thought of James, the shimmering skin, the glowing eyes, the way he had begged me to leave. "What's happening to him?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The sculptor chuckled, a low guttural sound that sent shivers down my spine. "He's transforming, becoming something beyond human. But the process, it's not always pleasant." "Change him back," I shouted, my fear giving way to desperation. The sculptor's smile faded. "It's too late for that," he said coldly. "Once the process begins, it cannot be undone. And now that you've seen him, now that you've meddled in things you don't understand, you're marked too." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" The sculptor didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, metallic object. A scalpel, its blade glinting unnaturally in the dim light. "You have two choices," he said, his voice eerily calm. "You can leave here tonight and live with the knowledge that you're being watched, hunted for the rest of your days. Or," he stepped closer, holding the scalpel out to me, "you can let me fix you. I can make you better, stronger. I can make you like James." I stared at the scalpel, my mind racing. "Why?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Why are you doing this?" The sculptor's expression darkened. "Because perfection demands sacrifice, and because I can." I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in indecision. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pulsating with an unnatural rhythm. The figure in the hallway was gone, but I could feel its presence, lingering just out of sight. I didn't take the scalpel. I turned and ran, throwing myself against the front door, which somehow opened this time. The world outside was still dark, but I didn't care. I sprinted into the void, the sound of the sculptor's laughter echoing behind me. When I finally stopped running, I found myself on the side of the road, the faint glow of streetlights in the distance. The house was gone, replaced by an empty lot. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, I've been trying to piece my life back together, but nothing feels real anymore. Every shadow feels alive, every sound in the night makes my heart race, and the emails haven't stopped. This morning I found a package on my doorstep. Inside was a small, blood-stained scalpel and a note that read, "It's not over." I don't know what's happening to me, but I can feel it. My skin itches in places that weren't there before. My reflection in the mirror looks off, like it doesn't quite belong to me anymore. And sometimes in the dead of night, I hear it, the wet, dragging noise coming from just beyond my bedroom door. The noises at night were getting louder. Wet, slithering sounds like flesh scraping against metal echoed through my apartment. I started sleeping with the lights on, but even that didn't help. My reflection in the mirror had begun to shift subtly. My eyes seemed too sharp, my jawline unnaturally pronounced. And then there were the dreams. In them, I was back in the house, lying on the operating table. The sculptor loomed over me, his glasses reflecting the cold glow of surgical lamps. But in these dreams, I wasn't asleep. I could feel everything. The cold bite of the scalpel, the warm trickle of blood running down my skin. And all the while he whispered in a language I couldn't understand, his words crawling into my skull like worms. I woke up screaming every time, drenched in sweat, clawing at my skin. But the worst part wasn't the dreams. It was what I found when I woke up. The scars. They started small. A faint line along my forearm, perfectly straight, like a surgeon's incision. I told myself I must have scratched myself in my sleep, but then they multiplied. Lines crisscrossing my legs, my chest, my back. Each morning there were more, and each one was impossibly precise. I tried locking my bedroom door, but it didn't matter. The marks kept appearing. I decided to take action. I couldn't live like this anymore, waiting for the inevitable. I opened my laptop, my hands trembling as I navigated back to the forum where I'd first found the sculptor. The page was gone. No, not gone. Erased, as if it had never existed. I searched for hours, diving deeper into the web than I ever had before, but there was nothing. The sculptor had vanished without a trace. That's when I noticed the email. It was from James's account. The subject line read, "It's happening to you too, isn't it?" My heart raced as I opened it. The message was short, barely a sentence. "You can't fight it. You'll have to go back to him. It's the only way." I slammed my laptop shut, panic clawing at my chest. Go back? To that house? To that thing? I couldn't. But deep down, I knew James was right. That night, the noises grew unbearable. They weren't just outside my bedroom door anymore. They were inside, under the bed, in the walls. My reflection in the mirror smiled at me when I didn't smile back. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys and ran out of the apartment, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away. But my body had other plans. My hands gripped the steering wheel with a force that wasn't my own, guiding me down unfamiliar roads. Before I knew it, I was there. The house loomed before me, dark and silent, its windows like empty eye sockets. The front door was ajar, waiting for me. The air inside was heavier this time, like it was pressing down on me, suffocating me. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, the walls rippling as if they were alive. I followed the sound of whispers, my feet moving of their own accord. The operating room was just as I remembered it, but this time, the sculptor wasn't alone. Shadows moved in the corners, their forms flickering and shifting, barely human. They watched me with glowing eyes, their faces featureless. The sculptor stood at the center of the room, his scalpel gleaming in the dim light. "I told you you'd be back," he said, his voice like nails on glass. "What's happening to me?" I demanded, my voice breaking. "What did you do to me?" He tilted his head, studying me like a specimen. "I gave you what you asked for, a chance to be better. But you refused the process. Now it's incomplete, imperfect. Fix it," I begged. Make it stop." The sculptor's smile widened. "Oh, I can fix it," he said, "but it will cost you." "What do you want?" I whispered. He stepped closer, his movements unnaturally fluid. "I want what everyone gives me, a part of yourself, something you can't get back." I didn't understand what he meant, but I didn't care. I just wanted it to end. "Fine," I said. "Take it. Just make it stop." The shadows closed in as I lay back on the table. The sculptor's face hovered above me, his scalpel gleaming in the dim light. "This will only hurt for a moment," he whispered. The blade descended and the world went dark. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment. The scars were gone, my reflection normal. The noises had stopped. For the first time in weeks, everything felt fine, but it wasn't fine. Every time I looked in the mirror, I felt like a stranger was staring back at me. My thoughts weren't entirely my own, my memories fragmented. And sometimes, late at night, I could feel them, watching me, waiting. And then there's the package that arrived this morning. Inside was a single note, written in that same spidery handwriting. "Perfection demands sacrifice." Beneath it was a scalpel, glinting in the light. And now as I sit here, I can feel it again. The itching, the shifting under my skin. I don't know what he took from me, but I know this: it's not over. It will never be over.